She was a German princess and the granddaughter of the famous Queen Victoria. From a young age, St. Elizabeth was very involved in acts of charity. Every week, her mother would bring her to the local hospital where they distributed food, medicine, and flowers to the patients and comforted the sick. But an epidemic claimed the lives of the saint's mother and one of her sisters. St. Elizabeth was only 14 years old at the time, and her little sister, St. Alexandra, was only 6. The princess grew up to be a kind, charming young woman. Many considered her to be one of the most beautiful women in all of Europe. She had many suitors, including the future Kaiser of Germany, but she turned him down because she had fallen in love with the Russian Grand Duke Serge, the uncle of the future Tsar of Russia, Saint Nicholas. St. Elizabeth's marriage to the Duke was a spectacular event. Curious crowds packed the streets to get a glimpse of the German princess arriving in her golden carriage. Noblemen from all over Russia and Europe were invited to the wedding, and it was at the wedding where Serge's nephew, St. Nicholas, met his future bride, St. Alexandra. Being closely related to the imperial family made St. Elizabeth a Grand Duchess of Russia. Serge was an Orthodox Christian, but St. Elizabeth was not. Serge's faith was very important to him, but he didn't want to pressure his wife into converting. Even though she was a very religious Protestant, the Duchess would attend Orthodox Christian services with her husband. She was intrigued when she saw him kneeling before the icons and kissing them. Because she didn't know how to act but still wanted to show respect, she decided to give a low curtsy to the icons. Her curiosity grew, and she began reading more about Orthodoxy, but she believed if she converted to Orthodoxy, then her English and German relatives would shun her. Serge helped found the Russian Orthodox Palestine Society, which helped Orthodox missionary work and Russian pilgrims in the Holy Land. St. Elizabeth was very excited to accompany her husband on a pilgrimage to the land where Christ had lived. When Serge and St. Elizabeth visited the magnificent church of St. Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives, she remarked, "How I should like to be buried here." Little did she know that her wish would one day be granted. Shortly after her life-changing trip, she finally expressed to her husband her desire to become an Orthodox Christian. Serge was moved to tears and revealed to her that he had been praying for her for a very long time. But her father and many of her relatives were outraged and tried to make her change her mind. They thought that Serge had forced her to convert, but she assured them that it was her own decision. She was overjoyed when she was finally received into the Orthodox Church. Trouble was brewing in Russia. Many people wanted to overthrow the government. They hated the Tsar and wanted to hurt his family. One of these revolutionaries threw a bomb into a carriage with Serge inside. St. Elizabeth, who was nearby, came running out to see where the blast had come from. She was devastated when she saw the gruesome scene. The carriage had been blown to bits, and Serge's body was scattered across the snow. Three days after this tragedy, St. Elizabeth went to see Serge's assassin in prison. Even though the revolutionary had murdered her husband, she felt no hatred for him, and even felt sorry for him. She begged him to repent of his crime and ask Christ for forgiveness. She told him that she had forgiven him for what he had done, and would try to have the Tsar pardon him. But the assassin felt no remorse and told her that he wanted to die for his cause. Before St. Elizabeth left the prison, she put a Bible and an icon on the table of his cell, hoping he would change his mind and turn to Christ. But her efforts to pardon her husband's murderer were unsuccessful, and he was eventually executed. St. Elizabeth had a cross placed at the site of Serge's assassination. She thought that her husband would want the inscription that she chose to place on the cross. "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." St. Elizabeth mourned the death of her beloved husband, but found comfort in prayer. She spent most of her time in church, rarely made public appearances, and rearranged her bedroom to resemble a nun's cell. She had found a great deal of joy heading charitable organizations during the Russo-Japanese War and caring for the poor, the orphans, and the wounded with her sister, St. Alexandra. Now, the Grand Duchess was still involved in charity work, but wanted to devote more of her time to helping those in need. she decided to give away and sell her priceless jewelry collection and use the money to construct a convent dedicated to Saints Mary and Martha. The Grand Duchess also built a hospital, a pharmacy, and an orphanage right next to the convent. She eventually decided to become a nun and was made the abbess. St. Elizabeth would often go to the dangerous slums of Moscow and would rescue hungry, poor children on the streets. She helped make sure they had proper housing, food, and received a decent education. Many of these children came to live at the convent's orphanage, and the nuns at the convent would prepare meals for almost 400 children and adults every day. The convent's hospital was considered to be the best in Moscow, and the most serious cases were sent there. St. Elizabeth herself helped care for the patients, and some of the well-known surgeons who worked at the hospital would specifically ask for her to assist them during their difficult operations. There was one patient whose husband was an atheist. He sympathized with the Bolshevik revolutionaries and absolutely despised the Tsar and his family. The man's wife was very ill and eventually passed away. The man was very impressed by the excellent nursing care that his wife had received, and there was one particular nun that he noticed did everything she could to help lessen his wife's suffering during her final days. He was shocked when he learned that the nun was the Grand Duchess. He immediately went to St. Elizabeth to thank her and asked for her forgiveness for speaking badly of her and her family. She assured him that she had forgiven him. He was so moved by her kindness, and soon after, he converted to Orthodoxy. When the First World War began, the convent's hospital was used for wounded soldiers. St. Elizabeth also wanted to help care for the spiritual needs of the soldiers and had icons and everything that was necessary for divine liturgy sent to the front. Along with her sister, St. Alexandra, she also inspected field hospitals at the war front. The Grand Duchess would also give the soldiers small icons and would personally dress their wounds. Led by Vladimir Lenin, the Bolshevik revolutionaries overthrew the Russian government, and St. Nicholas, St. Alexandra, and all of their children were arrested. Because she was a close relative of the Tsar, it was clear that St. Elizabeth's life was in danger. Her former suitor, the Kaiser of Germany, sent a representative to Russia to help St. Elizabeth escape. Even though she knew that she would most likely be arrested and maybe even killed, she refused to go with the man and abandon the nuns, her beloved convent, and the nation she had grown to love as her own. It was not long after that Lenin ordered the arrest of the Grand Duchess. They raided the convent and took St. Elizabeth captive. They allowed a nun, St. Barbara, to accompany her, but forcibly tore the other nuns away with cruel blows. Before she entered the car that was going to take her away, St. Elizabeth turned and blessed the nuns with the sign of the cross, one final time. On July 17, 1918, Lenin ordered the execution of the Tsar and his entire family. St. Nicholas, St. Alexandra, and their children, Saints Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, were told to go down into a basement. That night, they were shot, killed, and became martyrs of the Holy Orthodox Church. The very next day, St. Elizabeth and St. Barbara and their fellow prisoners were brought into the woods. They stopped in an abandoned mine. The Bolsheviks started cursing, shouting, and beating all of their prisoners. St. Elizabeth started crossing herself and praying aloud, "Forgive them, Lord, for they know not what they do." Then they grabbed her and threw her down a dark, deep pit. The Bolsheviks threw in the rest of the prisoners and hurled hand grenades down the dark, deep hole. But the Grand Duchess's fall was broken by projecting logs. She tore part of her cassock and used the cloth to bandage the wound of another prisoner, but the blows and explosions had wounded her also. A local peasant, who witnessed the whole event, could hear the voice of St. Elizabeth coming from the pit. She was singing. The Bolsheviks then threw in 2 more grenades, which landed right next to her, but they didn't go off. The peasant heard her chanting hymns of praise to God for hours, until the next morning, when he could hear her no more. The peasant knew that the Grand Duchess had received a martyr's crown.